Fritz Berlin stood in what had been his command post. Around him, the landscape looked like the surface of the moon. It was July 25, 1944. American bombers had just turned his Poner-Lair division into rubble. Bayerlein had fought the British across North Africa. He had served under Rommel at El Alamein. He understood how to fight a methodical enemy who attacked in predictable waves. But this was different. This was annihilation. For every Panther his crews destroyed, 2 more Shermans appeared. When his tanks tried to reposition, American fighter bombers dove from the sky and turned them into burning coffins. His men had a word for what the Americans brought to Normandy. They called it Material Schlacht, the Battle of Material, and there was no tactic in any German manual for how to survive it. By the summer of 1944, German commanders in France faced 2 Western enemies. Both had tanks. Both had artillery. Both wanted to push through Normandy and drive into Germany. But they fought in completely different ways. The British were methodical, professional. Their attacks followed a rhythm that German commanders had learned to read after years of fighting in North Africa and Italy. The Americans were something else entirely. They were aggressive, chaotic, and backed by an industrial machine that seemed capable of replacing every loss overnight. German commanders respected the British. They had learned how to counter them. The Americans terrified them, and the difference would determine how the war in the West unfolded. German commanders called the British approach the methodical sledgehammer. It was a set-piece battle every time. First came the artillery, massive barges that could last for hours, chewing up German forward positions with devastating accuracy. Veterans of the Eastern Front claimed they could sleep through a Russian barrage. But British fire was different. It was precise. It was relentless. It broke men's nerves long before the first tank appeared. Then came the tanks. Hundreds of them advancing in formation, grinding forward behind a wall of exploding shells. But there was a pattern. After the initial advance, maybe 5 miles, maybe 10, the British would stop. They would consolidate their gains, secure their flanks, bring up supplies. Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Poner Division, noticed something remarkable about fighting the British. They would pause in the afternoon. His men joked that the British stopped to brew tea. It wasn't tea, it was doctrine. The British were careful, methodical, and unwilling to overextend. And that predictability was something German commanders could exploit. German commanders utilized a mobile defense doctrine often called the backhand blow. The concept was simple. When the British attacked, don't commit the panzer reserves immediately. Let the British advance. Let them exhaust their momentum against the forward defenses. Then, when the British stopped to consolidate, and they always stopped, launch the counterattack. Hit them while they were reorganizing. Strike the flanks before they could dig in. It required nerve. Watching the front line buckle while holding your best units back felt like madness. But against the British, it worked. The British would gain ground. Then the German counterpunch would take most of it back. The front would stabilize and the cycle would repeat. Operation Goodwood would prove this doctrine to devastating effect. July 18, 1944, the British launched their largest armored offensive of the Normandy campaign southeast of Caen. Operation Goodwood threw 3 armored divisions, over 1,000 tanks against German positions. The attack began with 2,000 bombers, turning the German forward line into a churning wasteland. It should have been a breakthrough. The tanks rolled forward. The first German line evaporated under the bombardment. British commanders felt the momentum building. Then the advance slowed. Then it stopped. German anti-tank guns, positioned in depth, began picking off British armor. The dreaded 88-millimeter guns opened fire from concealed positions the bombers had missed. British tanks burned on the open ground southeast of Caen. When the Poners counter-attacked, the British pulled back. In 3 days, they lost over 300 tanks. The front line barely moved. German commanders noted the result with grim satisfaction. The backhand blow had worked again. The British were dangerous, but they were predictable. Then came the Americans. 1 week after Goodwood, the Americans launched Operation Cobra from the opposite end of the Normandy front. Like the British, they began with massive aerial bombardment. The carpet bombing decimated Poner and buried by line in his own command post. But what followed was nothing like a British attack. The American tanks didn't stop after breaking through. They kept going and going and going. George Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st. Within days, American armor was racing across France at speeds that paralyzed German command. Patton didn't consolidate. He didn't secure his flanks. He told his tank commanders to bypass resistance, keep moving, and let the follow-up forces deal with pockets of Germans left behind. German commanders waited for the Americans to pause. They positioned their reserves for the backhand blow. The pause never came. General Gunther Blumenried served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. After the war, he explained what made American armor so difficult to fight. He said the Germans considered Patton the most aggressive general they faced. Blumenried noted that Patton fought more like a German Poner general than any other Allied commander. He took risks. He exploited opportunities. He moved faster than the German decision-making process could respond. Patton was chaos. His units appeared where German intelligence said they couldn't possibly be. His tanks showed up at crossroads before German commanders knew the Americans had broken through. The classical German counter-tactics assumed the enemy would pause. Patton's doctrine explicitly forbade pausing. And he wasn't the only problem. German soldiers had a name for American fighter bombers. They called them Yabos, short for Yak bomber. The P-47 Thunderbolts owned the sky over France. They circled constantly, watching every road, hunting anything that moved. It created a psychological condition among the crews. Men developed permanent stiff necks from constantly scanning the sky. The distant drone of an engine didn't just mean danger. It meant the hunt was on, and they were the prey. German tank commanders learned that movement during daylight was a death sentence. The Yabos would spot the dust cloud from a Poner column and dive within minutes. Rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire would turn the road into a burning graveyard. This destroyed the German ability to counterattack. The backhand blow required moving Puner reserves to strike the enemy's flanks, but moving meant dying. German tanks sat in concealed positions, camouflaged under trees and netting, waiting for darkness. By the time night fell and they could move, the Americans had already advanced another 20 meters. The British had air superiority too, but American tactical air power was integrated with ground forces in ways the Germans had never experienced. American tank commanders could call in airstrikes within minutes. And even when German gunners did destroy American tanks, it didn't seem to matter. German commanders noticed something demoralizing about fighting American armor. Tanks they destroyed kept coming back. A Panther knocked out in combat was usually a total loss. Germany lacked recovery vehicles. Spare parts were scarce. And once the front moved, any damaged tank left behind was gone forever. American recovery crews operated differently. They moved onto battlefields while the shooting was still happening. They hooked cables to damaged Shermans and dragged them back to repair depots. Tanks that took hits in the morning were back in action by the next day. Crews that survived a brewing Sherman were assigned new tanks within hours. German commanders felt like they were fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, two more appeared. It was a uniquely demoralizing experience for a Poner crew. You destroy the enemy, you wipe the sweat from your eyes, and 10 minutes later, they are back. It stripped German commanders of the one thing they needed to keep fighting: the belief that their victories mattered. Bayerlein saw this firsthand. His Panthers had killed American tanks. It didn't matter. The Americans had more. They always had more. And unlike the British, they never stopped coming. In his interrogations after the war, Berlin described what Cobra had done to Poner. He said the division was annihilated, not defeated, annihilated. The American bombing had turned his positions into a moonscape. Tanks were flipped upside down by the blast waves. Crews died without ever seeing an enemy. Then the American armor came through, not in the careful British fashion, but in a flood that overwhelmed every defensive position. This was the true meaning of material schlock, a fight where industrial output mattered more than tactical skill. German commanders were trained in maneuver warfare. They believed that superior tactics and crew training could overcome numerical disadvantage. Against the Americans, none of that mattered. The weight of steel and explosives simply crushed everything in its path. And the nightmare was just beginning. By mid-August, the German position in Normandy had collapsed. American forces had swept around the German flank, while British and Canadian forces pushed from the north. The German 7th Army was trapped in a pocket near Files. The only escape was a narrow gap that Allied forces were racing to close. What happened in that pocket became a symbol of what American firepower could do. German columns trying to escape were caught on the roads. American aircraft strafed them continuously. Artillery pounded every avenue of retreat. Pilots flying overhead claimed they could smell the stench of death from hundreds of feet in the air. On the ground, it was an apocalypse of twisted steel and swelling corpses that forced drivers to cover their faces just to breathe. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. Another 50,000 were captured. The equipment losses were catastrophic. Tanks, artillery, transport vehicles, everything the German army needed to continue fighting. Some units escaped through the gap, but they emerged as shattered remnants, not fighting formations. The Wehrmacht in France had been broken. Hans von Luck survived the war. In his memoirs, he reflected on fighting both the British and the Americans. He respected the British. He called them professionals and gentlemen soldiers. They fought hard, but they fought within limits that German commanders could understand. The Americans were different. Von Luck found them less polished tactically, but their material abundance was overwhelming, and their willingness to take risks, to keep pushing, even with exposed flanks, made them unpredictable. In his book, Poner Battles, Staff Officer Friedrich von Mellenthin compared the three major enemies directly. The British were cautious professionals. The Russians were an unpredictable mass. The Americans combined material superiority with an aggression that negated German tactical advantages. German doctrine had answers for the British. It had no answers for what the Americans brought to the battlefield. German commanders learned to fear American armor, not because of the tanks themselves. The Sherman wasn't superior to the Panther or Tiger in armor or firepower. They feared what American armor represented: endless replacements, constant air cover, logistics that could sustain an advance across hundreds of miles, and commanders like Patton who refused to let tactical caution slow the advance. The British could be countered with patience and timing. The Americans could only be endured. By 1945, German commanders on the Western Front had stopped hoping to defeat American forces. They hoped only to delay them, trading space for time that Germany no longer had. The methodical sledgehammer could be survived. The swarm could